All right, welcome everybody. This is the Network Planning Working Group meeting for Thursday, July 19th, 2018. As always, let's see, I will put the agenda into sorry, Zoom chat. All right, there's the agenda doc. So I did a whole bunch of spec updates since the last time. The biggest one I think that hopefully everybody has seen was the rename of the network object to network attachment definition. That was mainly because we'd had a poll at the top of the standard doc for a better part of a month at least. Only a couple of people voted, so I made an executive decision, talked to the people who had voted, and decided on a name. Again, that only affects the name of the CRD object. It does not affect the name of the annotations. And that was intentional to preserve some kind of simplification of the user experience for pod creators, as opposed to the people actually defining the networks in the API, which are probably more cluster admins. So again, the intent was to keep things simple for the people who are actually making pods, and perhaps slightly more typing for cluster administrators. So I think that's the biggest one. Obviously, that is a much larger API break for the spec. So if you have implementations that relied on the object being named network, you probably want to change that. I updated all of the CRD definition itself, as well as a network object and all the stuff in the spec for that. There's a whole bunch of other kind of small ones. If anybody is interested in specific items in that list that's in the agenda doc and also in the email that I sent to SIG Network yesterday, please call those out and I can talk a little bit more about it. Most of them were in response to the action items that came out of last time's meeting and then things that had come up in comments on the doc over the past couple of weeks. Were there any questions about some of those? If not, I can kind of go on a high level of some of the decision or other spec updates that I made. If there are ones, just jump in and ask about those. If not, I will start talking about section 6.2. That was one I wanted to bring up. I changed or added language to say that the cluster-wide default network should be started first. Does anybody think that that is controversial or too restrictive? It seemed like that was sort of what we have been doing, or at least the implementations that I've been looking at. I'm not dead set on that language, but it just seemed like since the cluster-wide network was always supposed to be attached to every pod, we might as well attach it first. And if for some reason that cluster-wide network attachment fails, then we don't bother trying any of the other attachments.
I was thinking about this too. I think that it's intuitive personally, so I'm okay with it. Okay. I think it makes sense.
And yeah, that's kind of how I felt too, and I felt like maybe that should just be solidified in the spec. So anyway, again, we could theoretically revisit that if we wanted to. If anybody wants to revisit that, please do so on the SIG Network list, because, or in this meeting, of course, because we ideally will not be significantly changing the spec in the next 2 weeks before we formally approve it as a group. So that was one. The other thing that I did was in response to some comments in the Google Doc, and that was I updated the status and attachment selection annotations to allow custom non-standard keys. All keys that are not reverse DNS notation specified are reserved for this specification. The reason that this was updated was previously I'd said that all keys are reserved other than those defined in the spec. And I didn't, based on the comments from I think it was Leventa or whatever that person's name, however you pronounce that person's name, that seemed potentially unnecessarily restrictive. So I figured I'd just open that door a little bit for some other experimentation so that we can kind of see going forward, what other plugins might want out of the status annotation and the attachment selection JSON list format. Any thoughts on that? Does that seem like an okay change? What do you think, Mike? You're on mute.
I'm trying to find the text right now. It's
section 5.3 and section 4.1.2.
The agenda says 2 5s.
Which part are you looking at? Sorry, I'm on updated status annotation 5.3 and attachment selection JSON list format 4.1.2 sections to allow reverse DNS notation of non-standard keys. And I can really quick read that text that I added. Oh, you know what? I changed that to 4.1.2.1. 4.1.2.1. Okay. So anyway, the text that I added in both those locations was something like the following.
I see it.
Okay. The following keys are defined for each network attachment map in this format's networks list. Actually, this is what I changed. All key names that do not include a period character are reserved to ensure the specification may be extended in the future. Implementations that write keys other than those defined in this specification must use reverse domain name notation to name the non-standard keys. And that would be like org.foo.bar.keyname.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good to me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't change anything for current implementations of this spec. It just kind of opens the door a little bit for experimentation. Let's see, what else did I do? I updated section 7.2 to clarify the teardown failure handling, Mike, which I think was your comment. Hopefully that is clear enough now. Let's see. I added section 1.1.6 stating that implementations which are not CNI plugins are not currently covered by the spec. Explanation there is that we had some questions last time, I think, around a usage of this specification or an implementation of this specification, which was actually used in parallel with another implementation. And I think that was basically a device plugin implementation that Peter wanted to use. Is that right, Doug?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so he had the demo that just skirted CNI entirely.
Which I think is fine to some degree, but I think it's going to take a little bit more coordination and brainstorming to figure out how that might be possible. It also occurred to me that if his demo did use something like Multis, it wouldn't be, that would be a way to work around it, although with an extra layer, potentially.
Totally, yeah. I think this is a good addition. I mean, I guess my kind of opinion of it is that it is going to make more work for the implementer, but I think that's a good idea to have that in there.
And I did put the text future versions of the specification may revisit this requirement into that section because again I do understand the use case, but I think coming this late in the game is a little complicated.
No, well, I agree with the observation in the document, which is as long as we're using CNI plugins, we have to obey the restrictions for CNI plugins.
Yeah, and I mean that restriction is basically on Cube because it only allows one CNI plugin.
Well, that might have been the motivation, but the fact is, this is a fact of the CNI now, so we have to live with it.
Yeah. All right. And I mean, again, it doesn't necessarily. It doesn't prevent experimentation where you could have some coordination between a plugin implementing the specification and a device plugin implementing the specification running in parallel that somehow have a marker between them for one to ignore the network and the other to ignore the network or the other network. So anyway. All right. So that was, I guess, kind of a somewhat controversial one. I also removed or reworked the readiness language in section 6.1 to remove some CNI specific stuff and let network or implementations define network readiness. Let's see here.
Yeah,
Not exactly sure what I was talking about there, but anyway. Yep. So they can define the default network however they wish, and they can define readiness for that default network however they wish. And then I updated 3.0, 4.0, and 6.0 to allow cluster-wide network to be implementation defined, which allows the possibility of putting the cluster-wide default network into a network attachment definition object. So, any questions on that?
No.
Okay.
I reviewed this one earlier, in part because I had the question on the agenda earlier. So I appreciated this one quite a bit. Actually, kind of both of these two last ones, because there was my question about default network, and this looks nice and clean there. Because it was kind of what I assumed we had in there, was sort of it was up to the implementation, but now it's squeaky clean that way. And then, yeah, I had been working on implementing the alternate readiness method in the reference implementation, and this is also looking good and easy to comply with. So.
Okay. Yeah, and it also kind of goes along with one of the goals that I think Mike had comments that he had for the last meeting, which was to try to make things a little bit more generic so that in the future we could work with things or implementations that were not necessarily CNI plugins. I didn't get as far as perhaps Mike wanted to go with that, but I did take a pass through and try to reduce some of the dependence on CNI and process type invocations for implementations.
+1 looks great.
I think that's, Corel, since you're on, the other one that I did was I clarified how the status annotation should get constructed for CNI results that are less than 030, so those that don't have the interfaces list.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will see that one, yeah. So one question I was about to ask is about the section 1.16, enabling the network plugin that do not use CNI. This one I want to ask, is that the one you want to capture the communication between a device plugin and the CNI, or you want to see that this scenario is not using CNI at all?
Yeah, and I guess I sort of anticipated this, but didn't try to change the language yet. What I mean is a plugin, an implementation. And actually, I should really clarify this right now. Is that not CNI plugins? Okay, so I changed that to enabling implementations that are not CNI plugins. What I basically mean there is implementations that are not CNI plugins that Kubelet would not call via CNI. So
okay.
basically, the specification is at this point only targeting things that are CNI plugins themselves that Kubelet will call for add and delete. And whatever else those plugins do, whether they use CNI like Multis does or whether they do something else underneath, is up to the implementation.
Mm-hmm.
But
okay.
at least what this is trying to do is it's trying to say that the spec only really applies to things that are CNI plugins, not like some other process on the system that watches the Kube API and then somehow jumps into pods and does things that is not hooked into the normal Kube CNI driver stuff. And obviously this may or may not work for runtimes of Kubernetes that are not Docker, Shim, Cryo, and Rocket, because most of the other one of those may not use CNI.
Yeah. Okay.
Hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah. The cube word is something like that. Okay, cool.
Let's see here. Spec only times to enable Kubernetes network plugins. CNI drivers. Okay, yeah. All right. Let's see. Further points in the agenda. Let's see. Peter had a comment in the doc and was wondering if we could change the namespace of the CRD to k8s.cni.cncf.io instead of kubernetes.cni.cncf.io. So I was kind of looking for any thoughts on that. I honestly, either way is fine with me. We did just change the network object to network attachment definition. And so this would be sort of a, if we decide to make the change, it'd be sort of a bundle into that and would be changed in most of the same places.
I'm willing to use short names. I think, Cadus is a well understood abbreviation, so it's okay with me. But I've kind of discerned a general preference to not use abbreviations. So, I'm okay with that if that's what people want.
Yeah, it's everything is abbreviation, right? CNI, CNCF. So why not Kubernetes?
Yeah, that's true.
There's a point there. Should we put it up for another vote? I do feel like it would be fairly good timing to change that one because because we're in the process of just solidifying that change. So I don't know. Do we want to? I guess we could do a verbal vote now instead of the month-long vote.
Yeah, I'd rather do it on the call if we want to. I mean, again, there's still 2 weeks, but it feels like a fairly uncontroversial change, and it is fairly accepted upstream.
Okay, yeah, and we would like to try it for stability for the last 2 weeks, so people have time to give it a final read before final ratification. So yeah, I'm okay with using the shorter name.
All right, anybody object? It's perfectly fine to object. Speak up, please. All right, it will be done. All right, Corral, you have the last item on the agenda, capturing V2 version requirements.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, what are the things we have to capture for the V2? I mean, that's why my question was previously just to clarify that whether it's something to do with the device plugin. So I'm much interested on setting up some kind of the spec between the device plugin and the CNI communication. So I mean, the last week there was a lot of email chain communication in the SIG about this communication, how this communication should look like. So we took one path like gRPC communication, and there is some other communication is also available. So this one is from David and Vikas. I have looked it into. There are a little bit 2 or 3 sentences which I don't understand, but other than that, this proposal looks like a perfect match for the device plugin and the CNI communication, how the communication should look like. I mean, it's a one of the part of the proposal from the big proposal from the resource API, and this is kind of a starting point for that proposal maybe. So I'm just wondering that we should also look at the resource management working group, particularly in the SIG and the resource management, to see what are the things going on there and pick some certain standards what they are following and try to incorporate those standards in our version 2 spec implementation itself. Because we don't have the spec, like people are trying to implement different models actually. So if we capture this information for version 2, it will be easier to set a standard in overall within the community. So this is how we are planning to do the communication between a device plugin and the CNI. Because if you look at most of the models, what we are currently working is on the SRV based solution. There also the SRVVF is like a common resource for us. The another one we are trying to look at the user space. In this space, this vhost user or the member for like a common resources, they are like socket information. that is also a kind of resource. At the end of the day, we want all these resources should be configured by a CNI. So that's where this there is a requirement that we should have a standards between the device plugin and the CNI, how this communication should look like. Is that you guys think it's the something we should try to do it in the community, set up a standard on that?
I mean, I think it's worth exploring, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, I mean, also communication between device plugin and network plugins, and what is what roles are fulfilled by what, is really an area that's in flux right now. So, thoughts, POCs, ideas, and discussions around that are really things
Yeah,
we be doing and already are.
yeah, exactly. Because you can see the same objective, but it's implemented in 5 or 7 methods. But at the end of the day, the objective of everything is the same, like multi-networking with some scheduling thing from the device plugin. So how you're going to do is the different. But if you have a spec saying this is how we want to do it, then it's easy for the people to go and to do their implementation their own way, but just follow the spec. If some A developed a plugin and B developed a plugin, but they can able to talk to each other because they have the same spec. At the end of the day, it will be useful.
Yeah, I think that we should. I mean, the way that you put it, Carl. I mean, that totally makes sense to me. But the kind of the big takeaway for me here is that as we solidify this version 1, we should probably start a new doc that says, like, here's the stuff we punted from V1, and here's the topics that we're interested in for V2, and then try to prioritize those and maybe come up with like a punch list, like here's what's in scope for the next iteration, maybe.
Do you want to take the action item to create that doc and maybe scrape the stuff that's in the bottom of the spec at this point? Because I think we had a bunch of previously discussed topics, and some of those might be worthwhile revisiting.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can man that one for sure.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
And the rest 2 items is the same thing. So there are some kind of improvement we can do in the current spec, but we don't want to put it right now in the spec because we just need to finalize this one. So maybe we can take it to the version 2, so that we whatever improvement we want to do in version 1, we can do it in version 2. But we finalize this one right now for August 2. The last one is just to say that the thick plugin cases, it's for me when I was looking at this, there will be some cases there we are using meta plugins to work with both thin plugins and thick plugins. But if you look at the thick plugins, for example, in Courier projects, they have their own method of doing multiple networking. So in this case, there will be a confusion that which network object belongs to which plugin, whether it belongs to meta plugin or it belongs to thick plugins, and how it should implementing. So it's currently we are in the experimental phase, but we just want to say this is also one of the future we want to save it for the version 2 or discuss in version 2.
Yeah, I think it's that and Peter's POC. I feel like there's some overlap here in the concepts, and that's probably something we definitely do want to think about, discuss, and potentially address for V2.
Okay, cool. So this V1 version is the plan is to put it in some kind of the GitHub pages, or it just be alive in the Google Docs?
That is a great question. And haven't actually thought too much about how that will work. It, at least at a minimum, we would probably take the current doc and specification in Google Docs, and then I would, since I was the creator of that document, probably remove permissions for some things. I think right now anybody who has the link can actually edit the doc. And what I would end up doing is probably changing that so that anybody who has link can comment, and only a couple of people can actually change the doc, and therefore kind of like set it in stone so that it does represent the V1 spec, and then we'll just kind of continue on with the V2 spec. But yeah, I will investigate seeing if we can kind of post that somewhere. Maybe that even means like a GitHub repo under Kubernetes Incubator or something like that, and convert that into
Yeah.
like a PDF or a markup, not markup, markdown or something like that.
Yeah,
Sounds
because
awesome.
when we want to share this document, sometimes what happens is like they always complain they don't have the permission to see this document. So I'm just wondering if you put it in GitHub, it'll be easier. I can show it to anyone. Like, just look at this one. This is the spec documentation.
Also, from a developing a implementation standpoint, I would much rather have a clone with a markdown file that I can chuck in an editor. It's like a million times better. Also, PS on that note, thanks for removing smart quotes. I noticed that. So, yeah.
Well, and
very
I
happy
did
about
that
that.
because a number of times I've copied and pasted the examples into things I can just OC create or kubectl create, and kept failing on that. So
Been there too. Thank you.
all right, so I will investigate converting spec to markdown format and posting on GitHub. Also investigate. All right. Anything else that anybody wants to talk about today?
So I had a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So see, I was going through the document, the rationale behind this multi-interface implementation, right? And one very important common theme was service chaining, right? So is there a effort to standardize service chaining constructs in Kubernetes that you're aware of?
Yeah, so this specification does not attempt to do service chaining at this point. It's been discussed in a couple of places. I believe Network Service Mesh is trying to do something similar to service chaining at a higher level. And I think that's the only implementation or discussion and kind of spec stuff that I'm aware of. Is anybody else aware of service function chaining type stuff? I know also Tomo had a CNI plugin at one point that also did some service function chaining in a rudimentary way.
I see.
Actually, that reminds me of an issue with this spec, right? Someone was saying this spec doesn't allow CNI chaining for one network attachment.
It should.
Yeah, it should.
Okay.
I mean the chaining mechanism, right? I'm working on that implementation, but I think it's captured in the spec.
Okay, good.
Yeah, the config key, like so the CRD objects config key can actually hold or should be able to hold either a single CNI config or a CNI config list.
Very good. If that's not explicitly stated, I haven't reviewed for this. But if that's not explicitly stated, it should be.
Yes, you are correct. It should be. I will double check that.
So the one question I want to ask Dinesh is the service function chaining is you looking for a mechanism that does the service function chaining, or you looking that spec that explains service function chaining in Kubernetes?
So Kunal, so basically some more on the standardized way of chaining services in Kubernetes, right? So because I understand there are a couple of implementations, and everybody seems a bit different, in terms of configuration and the expectations, right? So so that is my perspective.
So I just want to ask, is that Oven use SVN, Oven Kubernetes project, use SFC, service function chaining?
No, it does not at this point.
Okay, cool.
So thanks, Dan. That's all I had. Thank you.
Okay. And maybe that's something we can talk about addressing in a V2 spec. Maybe that's something that we collaborate with other groups, like network service mesh or resource management to work on. I think that definitely is something a lot of people are interested in, and it's under discussion in a couple places right now, and we should continue that discussion and see if the spec could have anything to offer there for V2.
Well, yeah, I just want to voice my opinion or my editorial that I am also interested in that. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate it too.
All right. Any other topics of discussion or anything anybody wants to bring up? All right. In that case, we'll end it. Please, everybody, do a review of the doc. Next time, just to be clear, the next meeting will be August 2nd. And at that meeting, I and hopefully everybody else would like to make any absolutely final changes that we need to make and officially bless the specification for V1 and continue on to V2. So read the doc, fine tooth comb, all that, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye.